I'll not deny the hag my love. For duty have I died. Earlier this month, I finished The Bone Ships, the first book in the Tide Child trilogy by R.J. Baker, and this is exactly what I want from my fantasy when it comes to pirates, dude. I have loved pirates for a very long time. I was very young when the first Pirates of the Caribbean movies were coming out, and despite being very young, I saw all of them kind of as they came out, and I've repeatedly rewatched them over the years. And ever since then, ever being introduced via Johnny Depp and Orlando Bloom to the world of pirates, I've just been obsessed. I just love pirates. I love everything to do with pirates. I think pirates are some of the coolest historical figures in all of human history. Up there with like knights, up there with like Chinese history. Like, just one of the coolest eras in all of human history is the Age of Sail and the Golden Age of Piracy. And for a very long time now, I've been wanting to read a pirate or pirate-esque fantasy series because I just feel like we don't get enough of it. We get so much medieval fantasy. We get a good amount of Asian fantasy. We occasionally get Middle Eastern fantasy or African fantasy or even Native American fantasy. But there seems to be a serious lack of nautical fantasy. But the Tide Child trilogy, starting off with The Bone Ships, has scratched that itch, and I highly recommend it to anyone who is looking for something different, who's looking for a nautical fantasy. And as a bonus point, I'm pretty sure at least all of the main characters are some form of person of color. Now, obviously, the author is not. He's very much a white guy. But if you like representation and well-written representation of some darker skinned folk, I feel like this book definitely has it. Anyways, having said all that, what is the Tide Child trilogy about? Well, there's these two archipelagos who have been at war for thousands of years, and the way they wage war are on these giant bone ships whose bones are made out of these giant sea serpents that have dominated the seas for, I guess, millennia, for a very, very long time. But it turns out that these sea serpents have basically gone extinct, or they are a very rare species, and there hasn't been a spotting in hundreds of years. So these bone ships are pretty beat up. And despite that, the war wages on, and it seems like it's just a horrible cycle of violence. But it turns out, maybe all the sea serpents aren't gone. There has been a spotting of a new one, a giant one of the largest in all of history. So our main characters are tasked with hunting it down and harvesting its bones so that they can finally put an end to the war. Because again, if they harvest these bones, they'll be given a huge advantage and they might actually finally be able to win the war. What makes this book particularly good, at least in my opinion, beyond just being nautical fantasy, is that R.J. Baker takes real world nautical warfare and puts it in a fantasy world and twists it just so slightly that it becomes like this weird dark fantasy that works really, really, really well in my opinion. These bone ships are not the typical wood ships that you would think of in the Age of Sail with the cannons. They're similar, but they're these giant, basically, constructions of bones that are all like messed up looking. And the way they fight each other is through these giant, humongous, like killer ballistas that they fire at each other until they're close enough to then bore each other and kill each other via sword. There's no guns in this, as far as I can tell, at least in the first book. So there is a lot of sword fighting in this. There is a lot of naval fighting in this, where ships are firing against each other and trying to bring each other down. And there's a ton of tension because, again, the resource that they build these ships out of is extremely, extremely limited. If your ship breaks, you're dead. There's no fixing it because it's not made out of wood. It can't be fixed. It's made out of this basically not indestructible, but very rare bone that can't be harvested anymore. So there's this constant tension of, hey, if our ship gets messed up, we're dead. So that is like just part of what really makes this work. Also, the world building here is very, very, very cool. Again, it's very rare, I think, in fantasy to have a setting set in like an archipelago of all things. The only other one that I can think off the top of my head is, I think, Wizard of Earthsea is set in an archipelago, if I remember correctly. But that's pretty much it. Usually, fantasy is set in, like, Europe. Like, Germany, Ireland, Britain, France, Spain, occasionally. But very rarely is it set in a completely removed setting, like an archipelago. And that really works here. Not only is the archipelago very interesting, but there's like this entire, I don't want to say caste system, but there's this very weird and messed up system based around the incredibly violent nature of the war that they're based in. Basically, like, half the population is slaves. There's this entire, like, mentality of fighting in these bone ships, of men and women fighting. There's, like, this weird, like lineage system of, certain groups who are, like, disformed, or, in certain caste systems. And it's just, like, it's dark. It's dark and it's twisted, but, like, in a good way. And just, like, trigger warning, this is a violent book. Like, there's like, mentions of, like, child murder in this. There's violence against women and men. It's just, like, a violent, dark fantasy book. But, if you've been looking for something that kind of reminds you, and this is what it specifically reminded me of, was, like, Dead Man's Chest when Davy Jones shows up, that scene. This is like that book to, like, an extreme sense. Besides that, the characters are also pretty well written. They aren't, like, characters I think you'll call favorites, but I feel like they work within the world that R.J. Baker has set up. Especially the character who we follow, this main character, the woman, is a very interesting figure. She is basically, like, the greatest pirate sailor who ever lived, and this is kind of her story. It's her legend and how it came to be. Not only is she, like, the best in her, like, era, but it seems like the book's setting her up to be the best in any era, and we kind of get to see that as the adventure unfolds before our eyes. So it's a very, very fun and a very, very different take on fantasy. And, as someone who does love traditional fantasy, who loves, the goblins and the elves and all that, set in medieval fantasy Europe or whatever, this was a very nice, kind of very different take compared to that. And I really appreciate that R.J. Baker was willing to do something different to this degree, because the world building is very unique and very original. The characters are well written, and the story is incredible. And, if you've been craving kind of a darker pirate fantasy that is akin to, like, the early Pirates of the Caribbean, but, darker, less PG-13, more, like, hard R, then I think that this will really work for you. I give it, like, an 8.5 out of 10. I'm very interested to see what the rest of the trilogy has in store.